Well, I'm delighted to say that joining me on the Godcast today is Harry McGee, and Harry is a political correspondent at the Irish Times. Harry, it's lovely to meet you. Welcome to the Godcast. How are you?
Thank you so much, Alex. Delighted to be here.
Whereabouts are you today? Where's home?
I'm in Rathmines in Dublin, in the capital. So I was born and brought up in Galway, which is on the west coast. But I moved to Dublin in 1992, and Ireland's longest river is the Shannon, which essentially dissects the country north to south. It's a little bit like Loch Lomond in Scotland, except it's a river rather than something that comes in from the sea. But I crossed it in 1992, knowing that it was a one-way journey. It was a life sentence that I was never moving back. Because Dublin was where work was going to be, and so it's proved. Now, it might have changed a little bit in recent years because then, being on location was extraordinarily important. Now, less so. I think the concept of remote working was kind of unknown at the time, but it's certainly become more of a feature of our lives. So I found myself in recent times working less in Dublin, but you file political stories and file other stories from the west of Ireland when we go back down there.
Yeah. Were you always destined to be a journalist, Harry?
I think so. I think it was, I loved reading, and I loved current affairs, and I loved politics from a very early age. My mother was a GP, a general practitioner. She was based in Galway. My father worked with the Department of Agriculture. He was a civil servant. For a while, I toyed with following my mother into medicine, but in the end, I decided that I'd go another route. Initially, I studied law, and I qualified in law, and I did the barrister training. But I also became very involved in journalism, both at school and college, with college journalism, essentially, and really liked it. And in the end, I ended up doing a postgraduate course in journalism, and I loved it. I really did. I just loved writing. I love current affairs. I think it suited my own inquisitive nature. I probably had more raging fires burning in my belly at that time than I have now. So all of those things were satisfied and sated by journalism. So I've been a journalist essentially for over 30 years. And, I mean, there are some days, of course, that are frustrating and some days which are deeply boring. But when I look at journalism holistically in the round, I think it's a profession that I've enjoyed doing over the past 30 years. And I've seldom lacked job satisfaction in terms of what I do. And even now, some days you're going to be doing things that you've done before, and it does have a kind of a routine feel to it. But on many days, you're encountering new things and experiences or situations that you haven't encountered before. So I wouldn't say that it's endlessly fascinating, but it's not too far away from being endlessly fascinating.
And you've been with the Irish Times for a number of years now. Just for people who are on this side of the water, who perhaps are less familiar with the newspaper, just tell us a little bit about the Irish Times, if you would, Harry, and your remit within that.
Yeah, well, the Irish Times has been around for a long time. It's a long-established newspaper and media organisation, and it's probably seen as an establishment media organisation. It's disparagingly or admiringly described as a paper of record. It's probably the paper of reference, or the media organisation of reference. So it has a reputation, and a well-deserved one, for being sober, for being serious, for having a good quality of analysis and a good quality of writing. Perhaps not as declamatory as some of the other newspapers in Ireland, probably not as exciting all the time, probably tends to be a little bit cautious and conservative with a small c in terms of its approach, but it's a good quality newspaper to work for, and has always adhered to the most important precepts of journalism, which are really, accuracy, fairness, judging people according to their own lights. So, I mean, the paper, of course, has a point of view. It would be considered to be probably fiscally slightly on the conservative side. And then in terms of its social outlook, or in terms of mores, it would be on the whole considered liberal, and would have been on the forefront of many of the movements to liberalize Irish society. Having said that, there are always one or two columnists in the organization who would be considered to be conservative, if you want to use that particular phraseology.
Yeah, and your role as a political correspondent, is that nationally, internationally? How far and how short do the boundaries lie for you, Harry?
Yeah, we're unusual in Irish media organisations in that we have correspondents all over the world. Most of the other newspapers don't have correspondents abroad. So we have a London editor, we have an editor in Brussels, we have an office in Belfast, we have correspondents in Berlin, in Paris, we have a correspondent in Washington, and then we have correspondents or stringers in most other major cities, and we are about to re-establish a bureau in China. So we are well served by our own network of foreign correspondents. So when it comes to politics, the team in which I'm involved, we have 5 political correspondents, we have 2 parliamentary reporters, and we have a sketch writer. We focus mainly on domestic politics. So it's Parliament, it's government, it's what's happening within Ireland, and it's Ireland's relationship primarily with Europe through the EU, and also with Britain through Brexit, especially over the past couple of years, and other matters too. And also we would have a role in reporting on the North, even though we have a Northern editor and a Northern correspondent there. But sometimes, you get you get stories that are not easy to silo from each other, so you have kind of cooperation. But in the main, it's to do with the government, the executive, the legislature in the 26 counties of the south of Ireland, and what happens within the Republic or within the state.
Yeah, and we'll perhaps touch on a few of those subjects in a minute. I've just, but of course, Harry, as we record this podcast in the UK, we've got the business of Her Majesty's death to deal with. How's that been covered in the Republic? Is it as big there as it is here, would you say?
Well, it's not quite as big here as it is there. I mean, if you open up any of the British newspapers over the course of the weekend, I think you had, the Queen's death and legacy dominating all of the news and features pages, and even, making its presence felt in the sports pages. One of the big images was of the Manchester United team on Thursday standing for a moment's silence in respect following the news of the Queen's death. The coverage over here has been extensive as well, not quite that extensive, but the Queen would have been a very well-known figure in Ireland. It's surprising how many Irish people have met the Queen, who know the Queen personally, and thousands, hundreds of thousands of others would be very familiar with the Queen and with the royal family. I think the interest would have been increased somewhat by the Netflix series about the royals, or about the royal family, essentially, that has been widely watched in Ireland. But I think the main thing that has interested people, that has raised the interest or respect for the Queen in Ireland, has been her own relationship with this country, and it has gone from it evolved from the 1970s, when the Northern violence was in its full throes, and when Lord Mountbatten was killed by the IRA in a terrible bomb explosion in Mullaghmore, County Sligo, and that essentially poisoned the well in terms of the relationship between Britain and Ireland for a period. But once the peace process began, The Queen especially played a very active role in that. She met Mary Robinson, the president, when Mary Robinson went there in 1994, I think 1993 or 94. She had several meetings with President Robinson's successor, Mary Magill, and forged a very warm relationship with her. And that culminated in 2011 with the Queen's state visit to Ireland, which was extraordinary and which was so widely covered. She went to the Garden of Remembrance and paid a tribute to those who had died, not only those who had died, Irish soldiers fighting for British armies abroad, but those who had fought for Irish freedom in Ireland as well. And that was seen as a very magnanimous and very important gesture of reconciliation. She later appeared at a state dinner and gave a wonderfully crafted speech in which she traced the relationship between the United Kingdom and Ireland over centuries, but more particularly in recent times. And she even used a quite a complex Irish phrase in the course of her speech as well, which was very appreciated. And then Ireland reciprocated the state visit in 2014 when the current president, Michael D. Higgins, went on a state visit to Britain, which was widely covered over here, and essentially cemented the relationship between both islands. And these were symbolic occasions that essentially did an awful lot in the cause of reconciliation and in terms of fostering and cementing better relationships between both sides. And also, there were other very, very important moments as well, Alex, that happened. For example, following the Good Friday Agreement and following the cessation by the IRA of all hostilities in 1995, we had the spectacle of a former paramilitary like Martin McGuinness becoming a politician and rising to the position of Deputy First Minister in the Northern Assembly. And in that guise, they travelled the road as well when he met the Queen and was present at dinners that were hosted by the Queen, and forged a good relationship with her. That was also symbolically important. I think it's noteworthy that for the funeral of the Queen, which takes place in London next week, and not only is the Taoiseach Micheál Martin, who is the Prime Minister of Ireland, going to attend the funeral, but also Michelle O'Neill, who is the northern leader of Sinn Féin, will also be in London to attend the funeral. So all of these things were very important in terms of, as I said, improving the relationships, bringing back normality to relationships, and kind of establishing this notion that our neighbouring islands are friends rather than enemies, can work together rather than working apart.
Do you feel, Harry, that the Brexit has affected those relations, and if so, how?
Well, without doubt, Alex, it has. And I didn't think Brexit was going to happen, but maybe that was a bit of naivety on my part. I didn't think Donald Trump was going to get elected either, which shows a lot about my particular skills at predicting what might and what might not happen. Brexit has been very damaging, and it's something that is still, running like an open wound that hasn't been sutured yet. And there's a new Prime Minister in Britain who has elected in past week, and as of yet, we're unsure as to how she will approach this very difficult topic. Boris Johnson, during his time, the Irish government would have considered it as a period in which little was done to resolve the issues that exist in relation relation to the Northern Protocol during her leadership campaign, Liz Truss was quite robust in terms of her comments, and she promised to be at least as obdurate from our point of view as her predecessor. And the European Union have again extended an invitation to begin to try to renegotiate and find some common ground. But we haven't really seen Liz Truss reveal her hand as Prime Minister as yet. She made some quite truculent and quite robust comments in relation to Brexit when she was Foreign Secretary and also during the leadership campaign. But sometimes when somebody goes into the actual position, the responsibilities are different. I think sometimes decision-making requires you to compromise and to perhaps dilute in order to reach agreement. So we really haven't seen her reveal her hand yet as to how she's going to approach it as Prime Minister, as opposed to, as a contender for the Tory leadership. So we just have to wait and see. But the protocol is difficult. It's difficult because you're looking now at two different regimes, and it's almost like a Venn diagram, and Northern Ireland is the place that's inside the Venn diagram, and they're trying to make it common to both the other balloons outside it. But unfortunately, there's very little commonality between both balloons outside it. So trying to find something that brings a commonality within that space, that Northern Irish space, is very, very difficult. And we've seen all the practical difficulties that have been associated, all the political difficulties that have been associated, and the kind of the emotional and visceral difficulties that have also emerged. I mean, I'm looking at it from an Irish perspective, and of course, it's a subjective perspective. But my sense is that the European Union has bent over backward to try to find an accommodation to make it as easy as possible to operate the protocol. And they have, I mean, from our perspective, from the EU perspective, there have to be some rules in there, because otherwise the border of Ireland will be kind of almost like a backdoor for non-EU sanctioned or regulated goods to come into the European Union. So there has to be some kind of a standard to ensure that that doesn't happen. So it's trying to facilitate that without making it impossible for people who are exporting products and services and goods from mainland Britain to Northern Ireland to make their lives impossible through red tape and protocols. And unfortunately, no resolution as yet, even though from our perspective, I think the European Union has made a huge effort to try to reach accommodation. And from our sense, there has been some obduracy on behalf of the UK government in relation to that it's been playing hardball and uncompromising hardball for many months now.
Yeah. Harry, what's as somebody who's been a political commentator, a journalist for many years, what's your take on Boris Johnson? You know, we interviewed Alicia Vasilenko, a Ukrainian member of parliament, just a few days ago, who talked of Boris with the highest esteem. You know, he's kind of revered in the Ukraine, less so in the UK. From your own position, what's your thoughts about this former Prime Minister of ours?
His stock isn't very high over here, and that's mainly to do with Brexit. But you know, I mean, Irish people are voracious consumers of British media, of British soap operas, of British television. You know, I mean, you go to any household in Ireland on any day of the week and people will be looking at Coronation Street or at Emmerdale or at EastEnders. Our newscasts will always feature lots of stuff from Britain. So people will be familiar with Boris Johnson personally. I think as a journalist, as a technical journalist, I mean, I read his stuff in the past. There were two things that stood out. I mean, his skill as a communicator, really skillful writer with a marvelous turn of phrase, and it was also very good at humor. But when it came to the facts, we talked about the Irish Times and the facts being sacred. I don't know how long he would have lasted in the Irish Times. He seems to have had a cavalier attitude towards the facts in the past, and I think that might have continued into his career in politics. And I think the perception over here is that, all these things are subjective and nothing is 100% assured, but the perception over here is that he's a person who probably put his own career in front of the common weal or the common good, as a person who could not be trusted, that was not trustworthy. I don't know if that was a fair assessment of it, but it was a widespread perception over here. There was a sense that with Boris Johnson, that what he said sometimes didn't hold, and that positions that he adopted could be malleable, could be changed, could be finessed, could be subject to a dramatic U-turn, or could be just replaced with something completely different the following day. And unfortunately, when you're talking about relations between governments, when you're talking about international agreements which are underpinned by law and which have an international legal basis, when something stands until you say it doesn't stand, when something is real until you say it isn't real, when something holds until you say it doesn't hold, that doesn't really do a lot to encourage trust and to encourage stable and permanent relations. So I think that his stock generally in Ireland would be low. Having said that, I mean, there's been a lot of cynicism about Liz Truss as well, because Liz Truss has moved from being initially she took a position that was anti-Brexit, and that has now become a very hardline pro-Brexit strategy. Some commentators over here say that might have been a symptom of the race for the Tory leadership, that one had to show oneself to be as hard and as hardline as possible, and perhaps in government or in number 10 that you might adopt a line that wasn't quite as hardline as that. But certainly there isn't a huge well or reservoir of hope in Ireland at present that the relations are going to improve considerably, and that the Northern Protocol problem that's existed now for 2 years or for more is going to be resolved with Liz Truss as Prime Minister. So there's a certain degree, actually quite a lot of cynicism about Liz Truss in the Republic at the moment.
And from your perspective, looking at the British opposition, I think it's probably fair to get a thought or two about the British opposition. Do you think the Labour Party has got enough about them to seriously challenge the Conservative Party for leadership?
I mean, Keir Starmer, we would have had experience of Keir Starmer when he was a director of public prosecutions in the UK, and he was also he also did a very important piece of work in the north. So we would have been familiar with him. People would have had a huge amount of respect for his acumen as a lawyer and as a very good communicator. But you never really know how good a political leader is until they become a leader. There's a very famous Roman historian who described a particular emperor, and he said, would have been considered a great emperor had he never ruled. And sometimes when a person becomes a leader, you realize that despite all the attributes they have, despite all of the qualities they have, despite all their skills in terms of their intellect, in terms of their cleverness, in terms of their communication skills, that they're missing something as a leader. And my judgment on this is really comes from reading commentators in Britain and consuming the British media, but it seems that, you know, the Labour Party isn't quite where it should be at in terms of challenging the Tory governorship, and there have been some questions about his style and about the way that he is led and about some of the positions that he has adopted. You always get that with parties that are in opposition and those that have been in opposition for a long time, but I don't think the jury is quite ready to come in and make a verdict on Keir Starmer's leadership of the Labour Party. I think that's going to take a little time, and of course his big test will be his next electoral test when he goes into an election as leader of the Labour Party. What happens in politics, of course, is that nothing ever stays. You know, something happens and they say, oh, this is going to be like this forevermore, that things are static, that things are settled. But politics, as I've found out over the years, you know, it just shifts endlessly and happens in cycles that sometimes go very slowly and sometimes go very quickly. And you find that a person who is at the acme or at the pinnacle of politics in one particular week has slid all the way down the snakes and ladders board to the bottom by the following week. So, you know, Keir Starmer, I think he's been successful in some respects. I think he's failed to make a mark in other respects. But I think the jury is still out on Keir Starmer. I think his big test will come at the next election, you know, and that's when we'll know whether he has the stuff or not. It's not a very satisfactory way of judging the person who's leading a party, but it is the only way that we have in a democracy. Having said that, the Tories have been in power for an awful long time. They've been there since 2010, you know, they'll be there for 15 years or more. So one would expect that at some stage that enough people will be minded to change the government. I think the situation might be complicated somewhat by the rise of the Liberal Democrats under Ed Davey, who is a kind of an unexpected leader. I did an interview with him a long time ago when he was a young MP, smart guy. Didn't strike me as leadership material at the time, but sometimes people become unexpected and unexpectedly good leaders, and he seems to have done a very good job as leader of the party since his own accession to that role.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Harry. And just thinking about Ireland, I mean, prior to Her Majesty the Queen's death, the headlines that among the other headlines of Brexit and everything else was the issue of the cost of living crisis and poverty and fuel. Is this looking like a huge problem in the Republic as well? I mean, are you awash with food banks, for example? Is there a sense of concern about what's coming?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the Parliament returned only yesterday in Ireland, and the issue of energy inflation, cost of living, just has dominated the agenda to an extraordinary extent this autumn. I mean, the cost of home heating, of diesel, petrol, kerosene, electricity, gas has just skyrocketed, and the prices have just soared in the past year, and everybody's household bills have just become so high. You know, the reports last week in our own paper that the household bill for electricity will be about €6,000, which is about £5,000 from next year. So the one thing that we have in our favor is that the government is running a big surplus this year. So in terms of the immediate problem, there is quite a lot of money that they can throw at it without needing to borrow money from international markets. By an anomaly, there are lots of American high-tech corporations and pharma corporations have their European headquarters in Dublin, and that's meant a huge take for the state from corporation tax. So corporation tax has increased hugely in recent years. I think it's going to be €20 billion this year at the end of the year, which for a state the size of Ireland with a population of 5 million is a lot of moolah, a lot of money. And it means that at present, the government is running a surplus of over €4 billion and would have, if we didn't have corporation tax, we'd have a deficit of 5 billion. So there's this kind of windfall surplus cash that the government has at its disposal that it can spend in a cost of living package that is going to announce at the end of September. And while that will not be a balm that solves everything, it will allow the government to at least take some of the pain out of people's bills this autumn. So that's one thing that the government does have in its favour. Other than that, we've had a housing crisis in Ireland for 3 or 4 years. We're just not building enough houses to serve a growing population, plus a growing population of people who are immigrating or coming into the country, and that has led to huge pressures in terms of rents, in terms of house prices, and a younger generation are growing up who just can't afford to buy a house, not alone that, they can't afford to rent a flat or a property. And that's been a pinch point and has created huge political difficulties for successive governments over here. That's been exacerbated in recent months by a huge increase in the number of people who have come to Ireland either as refugees from Ukraine. There have been 50,000 who have come into Ireland since March, which for a country of our size, already with a kind of a housing and accommodation crisis, has presented huge difficulties. People have had to sleep in football halls, on airport terminals. You know, they have really had to look around to try and find emergency accommodation for these people. In tandem with that, we've had a huge increase in the number of people who've come in seeking international protection as well. So that's moved from about 1,000 a year, which is quite low, or 2,000 a year, up to about 10,000. So there's a lot of pressure there, and that's politically, that can be tricky to deal with, because you can get kind of nascent kind of instances of xenophobia and resentment of outsiders and all of that. And that has to be something that any government has to be conscious of. So there are problems and difficulties and challenges galore for politics at the moment. We seem to lurch from one crisis to another in our complicated and fragmented world. You know, as soon as COVID finished, we have the war in Ukraine, we have inflationary pressures, we have energy pressures, and that creates difficulties for politicians. But we're lucky in the respect that we do have surplus cash this year that we can throw at the problem on a once-off basis. The problem will become slightly more intractable if inflation continues to rise, if the war in Ukraine doesn't come to an end, and if interest rates continue to rise.
Yeah, Harry, it's been fascinating getting an insight from across the border into some of the political matters. It's been great getting you on the podcast. Just quickly like to ask you about the church in Ireland. What's the relationship between the church and the state after years of revelations of abuse and such like? Are the wounds healing in any way?
It's extraordinary. I mean, if you look at the census, I mean, most people would still describe themselves as Catholics, but I think their notion of Catholicism would be more like the French notion of Catholicism. I mean, Catholicism for weddings, for funerals. I mean, this notion of Ireland being a Catholic country where people were daily communicants who went to Mass on Sunday has been dispensed with in the course of just one generation. You know, Ireland has become, you know, in the space of 10 or 15 years, has become a very secular society. We've seen that with changes in relation to the constitutional position of abortion, in relation to the same-sex marriage referendum in 2015, and there is, you know, the deference to the church that was displayed in the past has dissipated. I think many people would now be indifferent to the church, and there are many people who would actively be hostile to the church, and there's justification, you know, in some cases for that because of what the church did in the past. You know, we've had scandals. I mean, besides its influence on government and on kind of the moral order, we've had very big controversies in relation to you know, sexual abuse that was perpetrated by members of the clergy in the past, the way that young pregnant women were treated in mother and baby homes, and the kind of the punishment and cruelty and neglect that was displayed to young people who were either orphans or young offenders in institutions that were run by religious orders in the past. So all of those have come to light in the past 10 years, and it has led to a huge diminution in the status of the church in Ireland. So I think its stock is pretty low at the moment, to be quite honest, Alex. I'd say most people who are coming of age now, and even those in the 30s, 40s and 50s, would not be regular attendees at church services. And our clergy, I mean, in some parishes are having difficulties finding priests because the average age of priests has risen into, I'd say it's in the 70s now, and in maybe 10 years' time we're going to have a huge crisis in terms of the fact that there aren't any vocations anymore. And it's even worse when it comes to nuns, to the religious orders for women. You know, their numbers have collapsed. So from many of the religious orders, they most of their members now are in their 70s and 80s and even in their 90s, and it's difficult. So I think the church needs to take
not great in a nutshell.
What?
No,
unfortunately, and the church do. I mean, I came across a I was doing research for something else last week, but I came across a historical journal, not historical, but it was a journal that was designed for was a Holy Ghost journal, the Holy Ghost Fathers. I think they're called the Spiritans now, but they used to be known as the Holy Ghost Fathers. And the thousands and thousands and thousands of Irish priests and nuns they were trained here, and they were told at the age of 17 or 18 that you're going to go to Africa, you're going to go to South America, you're going to the Far East, to Asia, to China. And they went over and spent their whole lives there selflessly, and many of them became very involved in the local communities there, learned the languages, learned the traditions, and not that they became native, but they became part and parcel of the fabric. And that whole generation, I was so, the journal contained obituaries for all these Spiritan fathers who had died, in the previous 2 or 3 years. And there were dozens of them. And every single account was an extraordinary account of a person who went over at the age of 21 to Africa or to South America and gave their life selflessly in the cause of the church. So perhaps we need to recognize things like that a little bit more, and perhaps we have been blinded by the faults and the sins of the church.
Absolutely.
Perhaps look at the good things that church and the church leaders have been doing in the past couple of years.
Harry, I'm going to have to thank you so much. I've just realised I've not upgraded the Zoom Pro, and I'm going to lose you in a second, but quickly, just thank you so much for coming on the Godcast, Harry. It's been a fantastic insight into things across the border in Ireland. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for asking me, Alex, and it was a pleasure. Thank you very much.
God bless you. Bye-bye.
Bye.